In a private dining room in Paris, someone paid $3,200 for a single steak. Not a chef's tasting menu, not a night of wine pairings, one cut of beef on one plate for roughly the price of a used car down payment. And that isn't even the most theatrical way people have paid for a steak in the last few years. Because once you look closely at what happens at the very top of the steak market, the price tag stops being about the animal entirely. That matters because most people assume price and quality move together in a straight line. And at the extreme end of steak, they completely stop doing that. It becomes about something happening almost entirely inside the diner's head. The steak in Paris came from a French butcher shop called Pommard, using something they call a hibernation process. Beef held in negative temperature cold rooms, sometimes for over a decade before it's ever plated. Only around 100 of these vintage cuts exist at any given time, some dating back to cattle aged since the late 1990s. In Miami, a steakhouse serves a tomahawk delivered inside a rhinestone-covered briefcase, the full presentation running close to $1,000. And the chef known online as Salt Bae built an entire global brand partly around a tomahawk wrapped in edible gold leaf. Gold that adds no flavor at all and costs real money per sheet, just to sit on top of the meat. None of these details are actually about how the steak tastes on the tongue.
They're about what happens to the person eating it before they've even picked up a fork. It helps to separate this from genuine scarcity first. Authentic Kobe beef really is rare, restricted to around 3,000 certified cattle a year from one bloodline in one Japanese prefecture. And that scarcity is real, measurable, and tied to the animal itself. A gold leaf tomahawk or a rhinestone briefcase is a completely different kind of expensive. The cow inside them isn't rarer. The marbling isn't better. The only thing that changed is the packaging around the eating experience. Economists have a name for products that get more desirable specifically because they're expensive. They're called Veblen goods, named after the economist who first wrote about conspicuous consumption over 100 years ago. A normal product loses buyers as its price rises. A Veblen good gains them because the high price isn't a barrier to the purchase, it's the actual reason for making it. Buying the expensive version proves you didn't need to check the number before saying yes. And steak sits on a strange curve when you chart price against actual quality. Moving from a $20 steak to a $100 steak buys something real, noticeably more marbling, better aging, a far more consistent cut of meat. Moving from $100 to $3,000 buys almost none of that same improvement. The curve flattens hard long before the price does. So somewhere in that gap between $100 and $3,000, the meat quietly stops being a product being sold. In 2008, a group of researchers at Caltech ran an experiment that helps explain what fills that gap. They gave people the exact same wine on two separate occasions, but told them it cost two different prices. When the wine was labeled at $90 a bottle, people rated it as tasting noticeably better than when the identical wine was labeled at $10. This wasn't just people saying what sounded impressive. Brain scans showed a region tied to real physical pleasure activated more strongly at the higher price. The price itself was reshaping the experience before a single sip even happened. The same research group later found a similar effect with chocolate, suggesting this isn't a quirk unique to wine, but something closer to a general feature of how the brain processes expensive food. There's no clear reason to think a steak works any differently once gold leaf and rhinestones and a decade of aging enter the room. By the time that tomahawk arrives in its case, or that vintage cut gets unveiled tableside, the diner's brain has already decided this meal is going to be extraordinary. And that expectation doesn't just color the experience afterward, it actively changes it in real time, at the level of the meal itself. Which means the real product these restaurants are selling was never protein or marbling. It's a manufactured moment of anticipation, priced high enough that spending on it becomes a story worth telling later. The receipt becomes part of the meal. It's something to photograph, something to mention weeks afterward, proof that the price tag was never a real obstacle for the person who paid it. Chefs who've run blind comparisons between elite Wagyu and excellent but far cheaper cuts often find diners can't reliably tell them apart once the feeder gets stripped away. Take out the gold leaf, the briefcase, the decades spent in a cold room on display, and the gap in actual eating experience shrinks to almost nothing. What doesn't shrink at all is the story a four-figure price tag lets someone tell about themselves afterward, at work, online, or across a table with someone they're trying to impress. There's also a quieter reason restaurants keep a steak like this on the menu, even when almost nobody orders it. It works as an anchor. Once a diner sees a $3,000 steak sitting at the top of the menu, the $120 Wagyu ribeye 2 lines below it suddenly reads as the reasonable choice, even though $120 is still an enormous amount of money for a single dinner. Menu designers have leaned on this exact trick for decades, placing one deliberately extreme option near the top specifically to reshape how every other price on the page gets judged. The four-figure steak doesn't need to sell, it just needs to exist, sitting there in print, quietly doing its job on everyone who orders something else instead.
So, the next time a steak shows up online with a price tag that looks like a typo, the interesting question was never whether it actually tastes that good. The real question is what that person was actually paying to feel in the seconds before the first bite. Because somewhere between the kitchen and the check, on that exact plate, the meat quietly became the least expensive part of the entire meal.